All right, so just a reminder, you got your switching forms homework last class, and that is going to be due in next time. Just turn it into the bin by the end of next class on Friday. I'm also going to give you something else during class today, which is just a quiz review. So your quiz is on the 24th. So not next class, but the class after that. And this is just extra optional quiz review. So it's not taken for a grade. It's just an extra optional practice to help you prepare for that quiz. And there's a key posted on Schoology as well under like an extra practice folder in Unit 3 for you to check yourself. So our warm-up is similar to the first stage of your homework, which you're supposed to have done by class today. So let's talk about what we're given and where we need to go, and kind of what else are we looking for here. Clear up some ideas I saw just walking around as you guys were getting started on your homework last time. What form are we given? Standard form, that ax squared plus bx plus c, and we want to write it in intercept and vertex form. So if I want to write an intercept form, what's our process to get into intercept form? What does intercept form always look like? What does it look like, Yoda?
It's like it has the x and
That's vertex form.
oh, intercept form?
Yeah.
Oh, backwards.
Good. Your two parentheses, so what Yalda would say, the two parentheses next to each other. Yalda mentioned backwards FOILed, which means I've never heard that, but it definitely describes it perfectly because that means you're just creating the other word that starts with the F. Factors, yes. So we're just going to factor this, and if you're thinking about factoring, what's always your first question with factoring? Do we have a greatest common factor? So you might not recognize the greatest common factor here, but notice that a value is -1. So if you take a minute and just factor out -1 from everything, it might make your life a little easier. So now you just have x squared plus 6x minus 16 in the middle there to factor. And what would those factors be? Noticing your a is 1 again. So this means it's that easy peasy factoring. And what would those easy factors be for what we have here? Well, what multiplies to goes -16 and adds to 6? Great job. So I'm going to have x plus 8 and x minus 2. So this is the part I definitely wanted to stress with everybody again, because it seems like one class period later we just kind of forgot it all. But this is without a doubt the most important idea, concept from this whole unit is how do you find your x-intercepts? So we want to also find our intercepts as well. And x-intercepts are really easy to find once in intercept form. How do you find your x-intercepts when you are in intercept form?
Set both of the factors set to 0.
Beautiful. Both factors get set to 0 because anytime I want to find an x-intercept, that means your y value becomes what? To find an x-intercept, what's your y value always? 0. And think about if this was equal to 0, right, you would just divide both sides by -1. So you would have 0 equals your factors, right? Because that's how your equation is going to equal 0. One of those, you want to find those values, that's going to make one of those factors 0. So you find xt equal -8 and xt equals 2, which means what are those intercepts as ordered pairs? That's how we write our intercepts, right? Intercepts as ordered pairs, what would those look like as ordered pairs? -8 is 0 is 1, and what's the other one? 2, 0, good job. Remember, if you have more than one point, no union, just a comma in between. Awesome job, so that's our x-intercepts. Let's keep going with intercepts and find our y-intercept. How can I always find a y-intercept? Ooh, Liam just had a really great idea, which I think some of you have recognized, but I don't know if we've discussed yet. Liam said it's your C value. Why is your C value your intercept, your y-intercept? Someone else besides Liam explain that. Why would your C value be equal to your y-intercept? How do you find a y-intercept? What do you think, Yoda?
The vertex form of this. That's what y-intercept.
I see what you're trying to say, but I think, so you're trying to start into your y-intercept, which means your y-intercept value, which I think is what you're getting at. Sorry, the y value for your vertex. But we're just talking about a true y-intercept, right? Like where you cross your y-axis. How do you algebraically always find a y-intercept? Awesome, Ruby. Set x to 0. So if you're in standard form, it's really easy because if this becomes 0 for your a term, like ax squared, and then this becomes 0, right? Because it's just times 0. So what always is going to be your y-intercept is that c. So my y-intercept is 0, 16. So we got our intercepts all done. I got intercept form all done. Now let's check back in and talk about my vertex form, and then I'll use that to see my vertex. What was the process called that we discussed last class to go from standard form into vertex form? What was that process called? What do you remember, Mithra? Great job completing the square. So let's do completing the square. So when you are completing the square, what is always the first thing you should know? Yes, within your x values, you want to take out what?
Constant.
That coefficient a. So I want to take out my coefficient a, which here is -1, and then I'd have x squared plus 6x, and then I'm going to leave some space to help me complete the square and kick that constant to the curve, which is 16. So think about where I'm going. That a value is -1. I have my binomial squared. Now let's see, what are we going to do to complete the square, right? How can I go from here to here to fill in my binomial? Divide 6 by 2, so this will be x plus 3. And then how do I fill in the missing space? Great job. So that'll become plus 9. So did I add 9?
No. You added negative. You added -9.
Good job. How did you know it was -9?
You multiply -1 half time.
Good. So then what should I really add to balance that out to make it back 0?
Plus 1.
Good job. Plus 9, so this will be plus 25. So here we are in vertex form, and I can easily see my vertex. And where is my vertex located?
It's minus.
This should be plus 9, right? Because inside here we really added -9, so I want to balance it out by adding 9. And then where's my vertex located if this is where I am in vertex form? Great job, -325. And I told you guys you should be using Desmos not to do your problem on your homework, but as a way to check graphically. So I wanted to just kind of show you guys going forward, like for the rest of your homework, how you can check graphically with Desmos. So let's see what we got going on here. This is how you could check graphically with Desmos. You're going to just enter whatever form you're given. So we were given our standard form. And notice in line 2 is what we got in our intercepts form. So let's look at the graph of 2. It's this blue graph. And what do you notice about that compared to the red graph? It's the same. So does that mean we did it right? Yeah, because I wanted to create the same graph, but just in a different form. So they should be the same. Now, what about here? I have my vertex form. And what did you guys notice there? It's also the same. So does that mean we did it right? Yeah, and you could check in on some key points here, right? Like just click the top to get your vertex, click the y-intercept, and you see that was 16. Those look great. Here I also have some x-intercepts at -8 and 2 as well. So just kind of check back in with your graph, kind of making sure you're hitting all those key points. Most of you guys on your homework last time when I was walking around, you were struggling with finding your intercepts. So some of you just like weren't finding a y-intercept, or you just kind of got to your x-intercepts and got a little stuck. But remember, set your factors equal to 0. So look at what we've done so far. We've really focused on going from standard form into vertex form. We just did that with our warm-up. And we went from standard into intercepts form. Now we're going to kind of go back through and kind of do all the other different ways today. So I'm going to show you maybe multiple routes, and you can always just kind of choose whatever route works best for you, what makes most sense, what comes to you first. Because what works for you might be something different for somebody else. So what we're going to do today is we're going to start in our intercept form. How would you predict you could get to one of the other forms when you're in intercept form? What looks like it's like set up for you to do. What do you think, Yoda?
Multiply out.
And that would get you into what form?
Standard form.
Great. So let's start there. So take a second, jot down our example, and I want you guys to work on doing exactly what Yalda was just mentioning. Multiplying it out, that will get you into standard form. So take a minute and do that on your own. All right, everybody. So let's check in with the table nearby ducks. What did you guys find when you multiplied that out? What did that equal? Anybody figure it out? Let's multiply them together.
2x squared minus minus 6.
All right, thank you for helping them out. So here, are we in standard form, everybody?
Yes.
Yes. Easy does it. Getting into standard form from intercepts form. Now let's talk about getting into vertex form. So what is one way you already know of how you could get into vertex form? And what would I do, Liam, to go from standard form into vertex form? What's that process called? Good job. So you would just have to complete the square. So if completing the square is your jam and you're feeling really comfortable and good with it last time, just keep working with that and kind of doing that. Did anybody just totally hate complete the square and it just didn't make sense? I feel like for me when I was in high school, like that was kind of something that maybe I was like, I don't really quite get this. But so if you don't quite get completing the square, if it wasn't working for you, here's another option for how you could get into vertex form. Let's think about, we're given intercept form and we want to get into vertex form. So if I'm given intercept form, what values on my graph can I find really easily? If you were to create a graph, what values on your graph can you find really easily if you're in intercept form? Your intercepts, right? That's the name. So thinking about my intercepts, if I want to find my x-intercept, I set each factor equal to what? 0. So here's me finding my x-intercepts. And where are my x-intercepts going to be? Good job. All of -3/2, so like -1.5. Good job. Okay, so here are my two intercepts, and I can see if I plugged in 0, right, I would have 3 times -2. So that would give me a y-intercept of -6. So my graph looks something kind of like this. What was another? And if I find my vertex, can I get into vertex form if I know my vertex? I can. So here's where my vertex is going to be. But how can I find this key vertex point using my intercepts? What is something we talked about on that first day? What do you remember, Mithra?
You can find the axis of symmetry.
Great. If you find the axis of symmetry, that tells you the x value for your vertex. How can I find where that splits right down? Awesome. So you can find your intercepts and you can choose, Yalda was saying you can put them in half, meaning you find the what between your intercepts? The middle. So this way here is finding your x value for your vertex is the average of your intercepts. So my intercept, I had one at -3/2 and another one at +2, and I can find the average if I divide it by 2. So let's think about adding our fractions. Can I add -3/2 and 2 together right now? What do we need to have in order to add fractions? Good job. So if I get the denominator 2 here, this will just become 4/2. So this will now become 1/2 all over 2, which I know it gives me an x value of 1/4. So this is our x value for your vertex. And anytime I know an x value, how can I find the corresponding y? Anytime, no matter what function you're working with, doing this for ages, right? If I know my x, how do I find the y? Think about x represents an input. How do I find an output? Amazing, I just input it into my equation. So thinking about my equation here, I have 2 times my x value is now 1/4. I'm going to add 3, and then that's also my x value of 1/4 minus 2. So let's think about what this will become to find the y. This would be 2 times 1/4, which I know is 1/2 plus 3, and this is 1/4 minus 2, which that would become 8/4. So this would become -7/4. So 1/2 plus 3 is 7/4. So this would become 7/4 times -7/4. Or sorry, this is 7/2, my bad. So that means your y value for your vertex is located where? How do you multiply those two fractions together? Just multiply the numerators together, which would give you -49, and your denominator would give you 8. So, what do I know my vertex would be at 1/4, comma, -49/8. So, here's the point for my vertex, so I'm going to kind of finish writing out what that equation will be over here. So I'm going to pause for a second before we write the equation for our vertex. What questions do you have about finding your vertex? The x value is in the middle of your intercept, so you found the average, and then you just plug that in. If just working with fractions is like, you're like, what? That's just like basic stuff, right? That's just like fraction operation. So if that's the part that you're like getting overwhelmed by, That's not the Algebra 2 content, right? The fraction stuff, that's like elementary school stuff, right? Multiplying fractions together. So if our fractions are still the part that's scaring us, we got to start getting comfortable with them, right? They're not going away. We're having a whole unit where you have basically big, scary-looking polynomials as fractions to work with. So don't get scared right here with our fractions. They're our friends. So here's our vertex, though. How can you write it in your vertex form? Think about this is my vertex, right? My vertex form I know looks like this. So what's my A value? What do you guys see? What would your A value be here? What do you see? What would your A value be?
2.
How did you find out 2, Liam?
It's just in front of the x.
Good job, it's front of your x squared. So if you kind of see here, you would have 2x times x, which just gave you 2x squared. And then what would go inside your parentheses looking at your vertex? What do you see, Mithra?
Minus 1/4.
Good job, you went right 1/4, so it's minus 1/4. And what goes outside?
49/8.
Good job, plus or minus? It's negative, so
Minus.
good job. So that would be us getting into vertex form. So if completing the square was something that you loved, you could have definitely completed the square here, right? You would just factored out that 2, and then you would have had x squared minus 1/2 x, kick that minus 6 to the curb, and then see how you would have gotten there from here, right? You would have had to take half of a half, which I know is 1/4, okay. And then I would have to square minus 1/4, which would have mean I would have done plus 1/16 here. And then this would have been me adding plus 2/16, which is 1/8. But if I added 1/8, what did I have to do to balance it out? I had to minus it. So think about all you would have had to do here is just -6 minus 1/8, which is equivalent to -49/8. Because that would be -48/8. So if the fraction work was the most overwhelming part to you, that's great in the sense of that means you're understanding just the Algebra 2 concepts, just the fraction work. You can keep working on that to kind of get you a little bit more comfortable with it. Just don't shy away from your fractions. Don't just immediately turn them into decimals. Keep working with them. It's a skill we're going to conquer this year. Other than that, any questions you guys are having? All right, let's see our next scenario. So why don't you take a minute, jot it down, and notice what form we're given, and then make a prediction on how you might get into standard form. All right, everybody, what form are we given here? Vertex form. Let's talk about getting into standard form first. What predictions do you have on how we could go from our given vertex form into standard form? What are you seeing? How could we get there?
Square. Parentheses.
Good job. So Liam is suggesting first we square inside our parentheses. So just take a second, write out those next to each other to square them, and then what would you do with those two?
Coil.
Good job. Multiply them through. So you would end up with x squared plus 4x plus 4. And then, now that you're here, how could you get in, keep going to keep getting into standard form? What are you noticing next?
Get rid of the -1 should give to the
Awesome. So let's distribute this -1. So I'd have negative x squared minus 4x minus 4, and then bring down that plus 4. And then what would be your last idea you see?
Combine 4, -4,
Great job. Those will just become
0.
uh-huh. So are we in standard form?
Yep.
Yep. Easy does it. So if I want to get into intercept form, what are some thoughts you have on how you could get into intercept form?
You could just continue from standard form.
And what would you do once you're in standard form?
For x.
You're on the right track. What's just that idea called in general to get into intercept form? Just factoring. Yeah, so one option to get into intercept form is if you know standard form, just factor.
Yeah.
And everybody, that's going to be what I recommend doing for you guys. So I would recommend you get into standard form and then you factor. So think about what we have here. Liam was kind of starting to put into some ideas into place on how we can factor this. Notice we don't have a C term. So he was kind of like, well, what are you multiplying to? So if you don't have a C term, notice how many terms do we have? 2. Whenever you have 2 terms, or sorry, what's always your first question with factoring? Awesome. Do we have one? Negative x. So that should be how you factor here. This will just now be x plus 4. Because then you're factored all the way. So you're factoring out your greatest common factor, because with just 2 terms, you kind of look for your GCF, and then maybe you might notice a difference of squares. But this was just the greatest common factor here. So are we in intercept form? Have we factored? Yeah, so this is you in intercept form. You factored. And if you wanted to take an extra step, and I want to go over this particular question like this on your homework. How do I find my x-intercepts now that I'm here?
Set x to 0.
Great job. Set your factors equal to 0. I know one factor for sure is x plus 4. What's my other factor? X plus 4 is a factor, right? So I know one x value is going to be -4. What's my other factor?
0.
Not 0, but...
Negative x plus 0.
Oh, negative x plus 0, or just negative x. Notice your greatest common factor here, since it has a variable, has x with it, that is your factor. So this would be negative x equals 0, so you know x would just equal 0. All right, so that's one option, factoring. This is, I'm going to put a star next to this. This is, I think, preferred method. So if you're looking for another scenario, this is going to be kind of your other scenario. And this will be finding your x-intercepts from our given vertex form. So how can you always find your x-intercepts algebraically? Set what?
Set it to standard.
That could be one way, but just any function, no matter what you're working with, finding x-intercepts. What are we doing? The what becomes 0? For x-intercepts, what becomes 0? Y. So if you replace y here with 0, now it's going to be similar to when you solved with like the absolute value functions. When you're solving with the absolute value, kind of if you're set equal to 0, that's you finding the x-intercepts, right? We did that before. So remember with an absolute value, you got that absolute value by itself. Same thing here, you're going to work to get the quadratic piece, so your x plus 2 all squared by itself. How would you get that x plus 2 squared by itself? What would you see to do first here? Good job. So you'll have negative 4 equals negative times x plus 2 all squared. And then what would you do to get that x plus 2 squared by itself? Oh, awesome. So we're going to have 4 equals x plus 2 all squared. So basically, let's see what we're trying to do here. We're trying to square the value, and it's equal to 4. So if you're not quite sure how to keep solving from here, notice I want to get this by itself, and it's all squared. How do I get rid of or undo squaring something?
Find the root, square root.
Great job, square root. So this might be a new piece for you guys. When you are physically writing in a square root to solve, I physically wrote that square root in blue. When you are solving and you have to write in that square root to help you solve, you need to think about the two scenarios that I could have squared a value and it would have given me 4. So what value can I square and it gives me 4? Yes, 2 and negative 2. So anytime I physically write in a square root to solve, you're going to include that plus or minus in here to help you with your solutions. So this is going to become plus or minus 2 equals x plus 2. And now just to get x, we have one more step, which would be, great job. So x values are going to be equal to negative 2 plus or minus 2, which means your x values are equal to what and what?
Negative 4 and 0.
How'd you know negative 4 and 0?
Subtract negative 2 from negative 2 and then add 2.
Good job. So using those two operations. So if you know that those are your x-intercepts, then you can write your factors. So if I know I have an x-intercept at negative 4, what's the factor that goes with that? X plus 4. And if I know I have an x-intercept at 0, what would my factor have been? Just x. But notice that doesn't quite match up with what we got an intercept for. So you look at your a value from your vertex form, and that's going to be going in front of, like, with your a, with here. So that is kind of another option. That one, like I said, a little trickier, a little bit more steps. I would say you're going to kind of keep working on those ideas later on. For right now, I think we're probably more comfortable with just factoring when we're in standard form, so just kind of stick to that and just know that that is also another option and more things we'll be working on with later. So definitely wanted to show that to you now, but what questions do you guys have here? Are you guys feeling more comfortable with the factoring part of it? Okay, yeah, factoring is probably what you are going to be more comfortable with, so we'll go there. All right, you guys, we're going to graph this next example, and then you'll do one on your own, and then we'll start some classwork. So take a second, jot it down, and I want you to look at it and kind of just think about what you're noticing first. What comes easiest to you? Kind of finding what key values come easiest, and then we'll go from there. Alright, so we have 3x squared minus 12x plus 4. What key feature on your graph do you guys think is coming to you first, kind of like the easiest thing for you to notice to help you graph here? Think about those key features on your graph that we would definitely want to include. What's maybe coming to you first, kind of looking at what we have here? What do you see, Vivian?
The y-intercept.
Yeah, why is y-intercepts coming to you first? But we're in standard forms because I know it's my C value. So what's our y-intercept?
0.
Great. Let's put that on our graph. What are some other key features we would want to include on our graph? Our x-intercepts. So I have my y-intercept. Let's talk about an x-intercept. How do I always find x-intercepts?
Set y to 0.
Great job. Set y to 0. And I should think about doing what? Value of y is equal to 0. What's your next thought? Creating. What are you creating next to help you find your x-intercepts?
Factor.
Yeah. So let's think about factoring this, right? No greatest common factor. And then you think about your a times c, which is 12. And so what multiplies to give us 12 and adds to negative 12?
Negative 1, 12.
Ooh, do those multiply to give you a positive 12? Or add up to negative 12?
Negative 6 and negative 6.
That's 36. Can you guys find any values? So if you can't find any values, does that mean you can factor this? No, so that's what we'll get into next week, what you do if you can't factor. So if you can't factor, then that just means you're not going to have like nice x-intercepts that we can solve for. So our x-intercepts, they're not going to be like nice numbers that we can solve for. So those aren't going to be like good points that I'm really going to be able to plot on my graph. So kind of know that you would factor and set your factors equal to 0, but I can't factor here, and we'll talk about what you're going to do if you can't factor next week. So that's going to be on the back burner for now. What other key values you can find in your graph, or you should have on your graph? The vertex. How do you find your vertex? You have a couple ways. How could I find my vertex? How could I find this vertex here? Good. One option is completing the square. So let's kind of go through and think about that. So I factored out that a term. So I'm going to have x squared minus 4x, and then kick my constant to the curb. So completing my square, what would we need to do? What's going to be inside with that binomial? That'll all be squared. It'll be x what?
Minus 2.
Good job. How do we know minus 2? Half of that. And then how do I fill in the blank here? Good job. So that'll become plus 4. So what value did you really add? 12. So that if I added 12, what should we do instead? So what would our k value be? Great job. So where's our vertex?
2.
Good job. So x value is 2, y value is negative 8. All right, so we have 2 key points. I have my minimum here. So how can I find, how many points do I want for sure on my graph? 5. I have like that vertex in the middle. I want to find 2 to the left, 2 to the right. I already got 1 to the left, which is my y-intercept. How can I find missing points on my graph? Awesome. What's a good X value I would probably want to plug in? I'm looking at what I have on my graph. What is a good X value I probably want to plug in? Think about it, I got 0, I got 2. Let's figure out in between, so what would I plug in? Great. So let's take a second, plug in 1. So let's say I have 3 times 1 minus 12 times 1 plus 4. That'll give us an output of what value? 3 minus 12 plus 4 is... Yeah, but 1 squared is just 1. Yep, this should be an output of -5. So that's one good point. I'll have a -5. What's another point so looking, I got these values to the left. What's another good point I probably want to input? And when I got the values to the left of my vertex, now I want to go to the right, so what would come next? 3. So go ahead and input 3 and see what your output is. And then what would be your next output after that? Or sorry, next input value would be like 4. So why don't you find those output values for 3 and 4 to complete your graph, and then we'll see what you got. All right, when your input was 3, what was the output? It should be -5, right? This would be 3 times 9, so 27, minus 12 times 3, so 27 minus 36 plus 4, -5. So 3, -5, and then if you input 4, what's the output? Inputting 4, what's your output? Good. All right. And it should kind of check in, noticing, does it look like you have an A value of 3? Yeah, what are some ways you might notice that? What are some ways you might notice?
Put the point after the vertex have like runs with 3.
Good job, you went up 3 over 1 in both directions. It's facing up, another good kind of visual check too. What other questions do you guys have here? All right, so if you also wanted another way to find your vertex, is your X value is minus B over 2A. Think about why that makes sense if you complete the square, right? You kind of think about your factoring out, so you're dividing by that A, and then you take half of it. That minus means that insider slide moving the opposite way. So minus B over 2A is that X value from your vertex. So think about here, I would have 12 over 6, which means we got that X value too. And anytime I know an X value, how do I find the corresponding Y? So our basics, right? Anytime I know an X, how do I find a Y? You put X in, so you put the number you know in for X, right? So instead of X, what am I going to replace it with? 2. So if you were to have replaced X with 2, you'd have gotten, okay, 3 times 4, so 12 minus 12 times 2, which would have been minus 24, plus 4. That would have given you an output of negative 8. So that's another way you could have also found your vertex. You just input that x value you got into that function to find the output. So if you don't like completing the square, you could also use that idea to find your vertex point. So it's whatever works best for you. Alright, you guys are going to work on trying this next one, and then we'll see. We'll go over it, and then we'll have you work on some more. Let's go through this. So, if we're thinking about graphing this and finding key points to graph, what is one key point that we could put on our graph? What's kind of maybe one key point you thought about first? What do you see, Evan?
The y-intercept -5.
Awesome. So I know if I plug in 0 for x, my y-intercept is at -5. So let's put our y-intercept of -5 on our graph first. What's something else maybe you thought about doing next to help you graph? I saw a couple different things that you guys were doing. So I love all the options. What's something else maybe you thought about doing next? What do you think on it? Find the vertex. How do you find the vertex? Okay, by completing the square? Alright, good. So we find the vertex. Y'all have completed the square, so if you completed the square, it might look something like this, where you have x plus 3 all squared, and this was a plus 9. So then you really were subtracting 9, so you add 9 out here. So this was plus 4. So your vertex was located where? Good job. So our vertex is located at -3 plus 4. Remember, your other option to find your vertex would be minus b. So that would be 6 over 2a, which would have been -2. So think about it. 6 divided by -2, -3. Yep. And then if I know that's my x value, all I would have had to do to find the y is just plug in -3. So we know the point -3, 4. Whoa, 1, 2. Alright, what are other key points we would want to include on our graph? Some other key points we definitely want to include on our graph. X-intercepts. How do I find x-intercepts, everybody?
Set y to
Good job. Y is 0, so I'm going to have negative x squared minus 6x minus 5 equals 0. What might you think about doing next to find your x-intercepts? How do we find x-intercepts from here? Factor. So I could factor out what value from each term? What's our greatest common factor here? You guys see it? What does every term have? A -1. So if you factor out a -1, then you're left with x squared plus 6x plus 5. And then you're easy factoring because you have no a term, or you do, it's just your a term is 1. So you have x plus 5 and x plus 1. Now that you're here, how do I keep finding and solving for my x-intercepts? Remember, our number one thing we need to know, how do you keep finding your x-intercepts from here? We can do it. We've done it before today.
set the factor to 0.
Great job. Set our factors to 0. So x plus 5 equals 0, and x plus 1 equals 0. So you end up with x equaling -5 and -1. So those points are -5, 0, and -1, 0. So here we have -5 and -1. And you could just find one more good point by plugging in, and you can kind of see over here you'd have -6, -5. What's up, Evan?
How'd you get that x plus 5, x plus 1?
We know 5 and 1 multiply to give us 5 and add to 6. We just factored that. What other questions do you guys have? Yep.
How'd you get the
Were you okay with getting this 9 here? With completing the square? So remember, this is really negative times 9, which really means that that was a -9. So to offset that, to make it go to 0, you add 9. So then, combining those together, you get 4. What other questions do you guys have? All right, so that just about wraps it up today. What I'm passing out to you guys now is your quiz review. So remember, this is just extra practice for you to help you get prepared for your quiz. On the front is a graphic organizer that you can use your notes. You can use the slides to kind of help you fill it out and organize your thinking about kind of how you find those key points in each form. Throughout there's this your quiz review. Really awesome, the quiz review and your switching forms homework. If you do both of those, you should do really well on your quiz. It's great practice to help you get prepared for your quiz on Tuesday. So I'm going to give you guys the option for the rest of class of whatever you want to work on. If you would prefer to work on your homework, you can work on your homework. If you would prefer to work on the quiz review, you can also do that instead. I do ask that next time you bring your quiz review to class, so if you have extra time, the lesson should take about like 30 minutes. So if you have time after, you're working on your quiz review to help you prepare for your quiz.